Karl Marx was one of the most innovative, perceptive, and controversial scholars of the 19th century. Though he descended from generations of Jewish rabbis and Talmudic scholars on both his father and mother's side, Marx applied himself to the study of political economy. Economics at its worst can be the study of simply currently existing most popular forms of trade or exchange, just mere commentary in a sense at its worst. But Marx was interested in how the mode of production comes first, and then the ideological justification for that mode of production follows. He said famously, quote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their social being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness," end of quote. So the mode of production comes first, and then the justifications for that mode of production follow. Instead of being a dead letter, philosophy ought to act. Marx said, "The philosophers have merely interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." But unfortunately, he also knew that human beings are trapped by the ideas authorized by the bourgeois class, the overlords, writing, quote, "The ruling ideas of each age have always ever been the ideas of its ruling classes." This is nowhere more clear than in the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he says that religion is the flower on the chains of oppression, the sigh of the oppressed creature. And he most famously calls religion an opium of the masses. A few years ago, when I would teach this, I actually had to explain that opium was, in Marx's day, a type of addictive medicine, a painkiller. But unfortunately, just since I've begun teaching, given the current opioid epidemic in the US, we now know perfectly well what it means to start off with a painkiller that becomes something on which we are dependent. And that's precisely what Christianity is for capitalism, according to Marx. It's the owning class, only needs to give their workers enough time off on the weekend to have a few drinks on Saturday, go to church on Sunday, feel refreshed and recharged for Monday morning. So next, that's the critique of religion as sort of a handmaiden to capitalism. And next, in the Communist Manifesto, we'll look at one of the most influential documents in political history. The entire document is worth reading, even if we're only reading sections here. But it is specific in its critique. Notice the list of demands at the end of part 2, many of which we actually now kind of just take for granted. It contains this nascent idea of class analysis that Marx would develop later at the end of his life in Capital Volume 1. So I'm going to explain his later theory of capitalism briefly, since you don't quite get it fully developed yet in the manifesto. Marx is interested in diagnosing problems in society. And to diagnose a problem, it helps to isolate down where a problem exists. So instead of dividing between rich or poor, as many misattribute Marx as doing, Marx actually isn't quite interested in rich or poor. Marx isolates between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the owners. They own the means of production, such as capital in the form of a factory. The proletariat are the workers. They don't own capital and instead have to sell their labor, instead of owning a factory to extract wealth from others. They have to sell their labor. So he's building on earlier economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, both of which he reads ferociously. And Marx says that there were 3 important types of value in circulation: use value, exchange value, and surplus value. Use value and exchange value would have been extremely common in terms of, if you read Smith, it's all over the place. Use value is what an item is literally used for. So the value of, like, a pen is to write. The exchange value is the monetary rate attached to that item. So the cost of a pen, maybe $1. Items then can have very high use values and low exchange values, like water, right? Very high use value. It's the most important substance out there, but it costs very little, all right? Or an item can have low use value but very high exchange value, like a diamond or stocks traded on Wall Street, which have no use value whatsoever, or only traded for their exchange value. So So there is sometimes some sort of correlation between use and exchange, but not necessarily. And things can have widely divergent differences between their use and exchange value. And that's because, unfortunately, capitalism has no mechanism for rewarding use value of an item, a commodity, or on the other hand, a job. Capitalism can only reward exchange value. So, even though a garbage collector performs a job that is far more useful than a hedge fund manager, the latter somehow makes more money. So, that's use value and exchange value. And finally, the third value, surplus value, is the gap between the materials and wages that go into making a product and the exchange value for which the product is sold. So it's a gap between the full, if I'm paid to make an item, it's my wages plus everything that goes into the production, plus even the overhead or the bills, keeping the lights on, everything all together. There's a gap between all of that cost and what the item sells for. And that minimal difference is surplus value. That's what the owner wants to extract and accumulate for him or herself. So if I work a job, I can assume that I'm paid less than the owner gets out of my labor. The owner doesn't have to labor much. He or she gets to take the extra surplus from the value that my work generates. And this is what Marx calls the exploitation of the proletariat. And this is what he finds fundamentally wrong with capitalism, is that even if it's not terrible, it relies on some fundamental exploitation of people who have to sell their labor to people who own the means of production and can simply sit back while other people give them the surplus of their labor. So that gives us a sense in which this is what, like when Marx says exploitation of the proletariat, he's talking about the proletariat who are workers being exploited by the owners, the bourgeoisie. And this gives us a working definition of capitalism. Capitalism is a mode of production wherein the large majority of people are, by definition, never paid for the full value of their work. If you are paid for the full value of your work, it is by definition not capitalism. So that's why the ideal for socialism is either starting your own business where you keep all of the surplus, or working in a worker-run collective where you all get to vote and collectively decide how revenues are distributed and used. So there's plenty more that we could explore, such as how in the manifesto you might notice Marx is fine with having personal property, such as a house, but not private property, which is by definition property, and in this definition it's property. Private property is property used to extract more money, such as a factory. There's a difference between a personal property of a house or car and a factory, which is used to extract more money, but is not used for any other purpose. Or Marx's idea, perhaps we could discuss, about how we might eventually transition back to a moneyless society, just as we, cooperated without money for the first 98% of our species history. But you can explore all that on your own. I hope you enjoy reading this fiery figure.